This episode of Legacy and Lux discusses sensitive topics including mental health, suicide, sex trafficking, and child exploitation. Listener discretion is advised.
His battle was, I'm Commander Grant Edwards, I'm Australia's strongest man.
Police Commander Grant Edwards could soon hold a world record for pulling a C-17 aircraft with sheer muscle power.
Ladies and gents, welcome back. Today's guest is a man many people may be familiar with. He's known as one of Australia's top cops, Australia's strongest man, and a man that has been featured in our television over the years. More importantly, he's a man that embodies the core of our Australian values, having dedicated a huge part of his life to serving the country. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Yara.
Now,
Pleasure.
I'll dive into the beginning of your career when you began with the Australian Federal Police.
Mm-hmm.
So you've operated in environments most people only see in movies. What did you think the job would be versus what it actually turned out to be for you?
That's a very good question, because when I joined, the breadth of work that the AFP didn't exist. So for me, I guess I had that youthful idea and of wanting to join police to be able to help people, ostensibly lock up bad people. That was it. And I had a focus or an idea of where I wanted to go. I mean, my aspiration was to do drug work, which I did. So, in transnational drug work. As I moved through, and you become more experienced, you realise it's more than that. So there's an idiom that some use in the policing, and it goes something like, you join the police to change the world, but you leave the police changed by the world. And that's a succinct way of explaining it, because what I found was it was far more than just going out and arresting people. Of course, that's the core business. But there's so many other things, especially that the AFP does now, overseas, in response to various things. Counter-terrorism didn't exist when I joined. So it broadened its reach quite significantly. But more importantly, from my personal perspective, towards the end of my career, I realised what the job gives you, what you take away from the job. And that is the issues around mental health and the issues around the psychological injuries, not just the physical injuries. Because for most of my career, every injury that a police officer got was always a physical injury. The whole mental health thing wasn't a part back then.
It's looked at very black and white, isn't it? That you join the police force, you're there to save people's lives, but that aspect, the mental health aspect as well, is not very spoken about out loud.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's better now, and I think as the younger generations come through, it will get better, because they're more aligned and more understand about the mental health. But certainly through my career, it was the elephant in the room. It was never spoken about.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's to do with the culture of police, because any indication of having a mental health injury, the stigma would kick in straight away. So that is, and I did exactly that with when I first was struggling, because it's perceived as a weakness. It's perceived as not having the strength to be able to do what everybody else does, and it dilutes the significance of mental health. And the other element of the stigma was it was just never spoken about. So there were so many people I got to know over the years that suffered alone and in silence.
Yeah.
And some of those didn't make it.
Yeah, unfortunately. I'll talk about that a little bit later on because that's definitely a point of interest. But one of the things that I also wanted to ask you is you established the AFP's transnational sexual exploitation trafficking team. How significant was that moment for the federal police?
At the time, it was very significant because up until then, the AFP really wasn't a victim-based organisation. Not certainly outside of the ACT, where they have the same jurisdictional responsibilities as say New South Wales Police, Queensland Police. It's only a small fraction of what the AFP does. So when I say a victimless crime, what I mean is dealing directly with victims. Yes, we'd seize lots of drugs, we'd do things like that, but we rarely dealt with a victim, and we weren't trained in working with victims. But how it all came about, I call myself the accidental expert because I didn't know what it was. I was just sitting at my desk one day, and my boss come down and threw this paper on my desk, and he said, "You need to fix this prostitution thing." And I'm like, "What? What prostitution? We don't do that on this side." And he said, "Read the paper." And it was about the human trafficking, specifically the sexual servitude. And that was being, I guess, highlighted by a pretty significant media campaign that was happening in the Australian newspaper, who were every week were identifying the weaknesses of how Australia and law enforcement weren't appropriately dealing with the sex trafficking. And of course, that got the interest of the politicians. And when politicians get involved, that changes the complete environment. So I got sent to a conference in Washington, DC, because the person that was supposed to go was a chap from the Australian Institute of Criminology. He had a PhD, was very, very well versed in it. He couldn't make it, so for some reason, I drew the lucky straw.
Fell into your lap.
In 2 weeks, I went from not knowing what sex trafficking was to be put in a role in this conference as a moderator for one of the sessions. It was the steepest learning curve I ever had. What that meant was that I looked forward thinking, okay, this is going to become something significant. We didn't have the budget for it. We didn't have the training for it. But out of that conference, and that conference was run by the US Department of State, and it was actually had Colin Powell was one of the keynote speakers, for those that remember back that far, the former military general, but also became a politician. And there was a lot of heavy hitters there. So what happened after that, when I got back, there was an expectation that we had to put policy proposals together for funding. Now, I'd never done that before. Up until then, I didn't have any idea. But I got help within the organisation, and we did that. And the organisation ended up getting, I think from memory, it was $35 to $40 million to set up these teams. And we had to really start from scratch, basically gaining whatever we could get information from our partners overseas and things like that. The important part of all that, as I mentioned, was the victim side. And I learned very quickly that where the law enforcement or policing entities failed was because they didn't take a victim-centric focus. So what was happening before all this media attention was the women that were discovered or removed that had been trafficked over here, they were essentially treated under the immigration law. So they were basically packed up and sent back to their home. That's not how you deal with this. I mean, you're talking about a woman mostly, not always, but mostly were deceptively recruited. So they didn't know what they were coming for. They thought they were coming over to learn to be a hairdresser or to be an au pair or something like that. But then when they got here, they'd have their passports confiscated, and they'd inherit around those days about a $35,000 debt, which meant that that's what they had to pay off by doing sex work. And a lot of them had no idea what they were doing. They were very traumatized. The other problem for us with that was that most of these women were from Southeast Asia, and they didn't trust police. And I understand why, because of corruption, because of what happens in those countries. And when we did start to do work in that space, we had to change the way that we adopted our processes and to get people to think in that space. And that was a huge shift. So it was a very quick learning curve. And there was pressure to use, we were given stronger legislation. The other component that came along with that was the child exploitation. So we had a small footprint in regards to the digital issues. So in those days, I'm talking early 2000s, so the internet really commercially had only just kicked off. But a lot of sex offenders were using the internet to trade images or videos and things like that. And also Australia had an extraterritorial law, which means that what Australia could do, for instance, giving an example, if there was an Australian, say, in Thailand that had committed offences against a child and the Thai police or the Thai government didn't want to prosecute, we could bring them back to Australia and prosecute them under the Australian laws. So there was all these different machinations taking place, and trying to bring that all under one umbrella, because there's very different skill sets in all of that. The other side of it was we didn't have the psychological support. So some of the things that we were seeing and from the stories that the women were telling us, and especially the ones that involved children, it was horrendous what you had to go through.
You essentially led that movement because you became chair of Interpol's expert working group on trafficking women and children. And what did that role involve at a global level?
I mean, Interpol has 190 member countries, I think, last time I looked. In any multinational organisation like that, it is often very difficult because you're dealing with a lot of different cultures, ethnicities, laws. Some don't have laws. And Interpol is an enforcement agency, so they don't actually go out and enforce, but what they do is look at expertise, look at intelligence, look at information and the systems, and do that. The hardest part that I found in that was exactly that, is dealing with the very, very diverse cultures and trying to get everyone together, in the one mindset. And because the technology was advancing so quickly, a lot of the work that we ended up doing in that space was technologically based. So you not only had to think like a police officer, you had to think like an anthropologist, you had to also think like a social worker, and at the same time think like a politician, trying to bring everyone together, without heated arguments and threats to harm one another.
Yeah, I was going to say it must be like a politician's job, because you have to get everyone in the same room, thinking the same way and agreeing on the same ideas and ways to address this head on. Yeah,
and because it's such an emotive topic too, it draws emotions in as well. There were some countries that said we don't have a problem with that, and we knew they did. Because they treated it as prostitution, so it was a willingness, not involved in the movement. And other countries were very critical of that. And, I think I also had to be part firefighter because I felt like I was putting fires out all the time as well.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Now, you also became commander of the AFP's Afghanistan mission, and in Timor-Leste, you were responsible for the police development program and advising the Secretary of State for security. What did rebuilding a police force in a fragile nation actually involve for you?
It's very difficult. It's far more difficult than I first thought, and it's far more difficult for people that don't understand what happens. So just very quickly, Timor has had a number of conflicts, from 99 when the Indonesians were there and Indonesians left. And then in 2006, the police and the military fought one another and were killing one another. The United Nations had been involved, and the United Nations, I talked about Interpol, well, the United Nations are far more clunky than that. So Australia had a development program there, but it was mostly run by contractors, consultants. So the Australian government thought, well, we need to boost that up. So I went over there to start that process. When you look at rebuilding, it's most people think it's training. You just train these people better. It's way more different than that. It's about capacity building, and that's very different to training, because capacity build, you're trying to build the capacity of those people to actually do what they need to do, not just train them in something and walk away. But you're also dealing again, with a very different culture. There was still anxiety between Australia and Timor with regard to the oil reserve, where back in the day, I think it'd be fair to say that the Timorese were less than happy with the percentage they got of the oil field. Australia had pressured them. Okay. There's also a historical influence there with Indonesians and the Portuguese. The Portuguese are still very influenced there. And rebuilding starts at a very basic level. I mean, you've got to look at all the capacities there. The hardest part was getting the police to adhere to the rule of law, which is the universal the universal way that you police, and that includes gender or all the other things. They were very much of the idea of operating like Indonesian police were at the time, where it was all done through fear and through punishment, like hitting people, things like that. But the hardest part is, and in most developing countries, the military and the police are very far apart in terms of the hierarchy. So the military are always attract the best candidates, usually. Police not so. I saw that more in Afghanistan than I did in Timor. So sometimes you're dealing with I don't want to be unfair, but a lower capacity of human capability, and a fair few, I would say more than a fair few, are illiterate. So not even being able to read or write properly, which made training that much harder. And, we found ways to overcome that. But it was difficult. The hardest part for me was I was only there 2 weeks when the assassination attempt on the president and the prime minister took place.
Oh, okay.
And that very much derailed us to a degree.
I'd imagine
at the time. And a small group of us end up having to go and, if you like, work for the Timorese to try and help them capture and prosecute those that had made the attempt. That in itself was very different, because you had police doing the investigation against military who were the ones that had, if you like, commenced the coup, and that hatred or that dislike for one another was still existent back then. So we had to be very careful how we did that.
And how to navigate that, especially commanding a mission like that. It would be a lot different to what you used to back in Australia. It's different people, different ways of thinking, and it's definitely managing the ways of the police versus military, different to how it is here in Australia, where it's one joint government unit working for the cause and the best of the country. So for sure. So you led the AFP operations and partnerships across Afghanistan, the Americas, and alongside organizations like Interpol and the UN as the most senior commander. How different is leadership in conflict environments compared to Australia? So you'd spoken a little bit about it through what you'd gone through in Timor-Leste and in Afghanistan, but leadership in general, I would assume, in conflict environments like that versus in Australia would be vastly different. A lot of unrest. There could be corruption probably as well. How are you able to navigate those waters?
It is very different, because you can't use your leadership skills that say that you're taught in Australia for Australian specific purposes, or any developed country around the world, because one, it is an acutely different environment, but two, it's a far more reactionary environment. So you don't have the ability to be able to sort of ponder, to be able to plan, to be able to do things. You do the best you can, but it's such a fluid environment, especially in the early days. And when you're dealing with a post-conflict, it's even more. I personally adopted the approach that from my perspective, it had to be about the human element, because I had I think we got funding for 80 people to come over. The AFP already had 50 in the UN contingent. Now, I wasn't responsible for that per se, but I was, if you like, overseeing that to help the contingent commander in terms of responsibility to Australia. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I also the security advisor to the Secretary of State for security. So that's they're three very different things all operating at the same time. I mean, I was blessed I had very good people working with me. But when you're in a situation like that where you've got people away from home, away from family for extended periods of time, you got to focus more on that side. It was unfortunate that when I was first up there was the global financial crisis. And a lot of the guys especially, because they're getting paid good money, they'd invested in the stock market and they were watching their, their
the
well-earned life
savings,
savings go down the drain, and having to get them back on track to be able to focus on the work that we were doing, making sure that we were as harmonious as possible. Because what I found was, because we had so many good people, that the work would look after itself. I mean, like I said, I had good people there, folks that knew what they were doing, but it's always the things outside of that. So you've got a responsibility to the country first, because you're looked at as Australian. We wore the Australian flag. You've also got responsibility to the AFP as well. And then you've got the responsibility to yourself and your family. And if any one of those things starts to break or fracture, that's a massive problem. If you can keep people as happy as they can be and as healthy as they can be and as safe as they can be, well, then the work tends to look after itself.
Speaking on people, how were you able to manage that responsibility of their safety, especially in an environment like that? I would assume there was some unrest. And as a leader, you would have that heavy weight of that responsibility overseeing them. How were you able to manage that? Is it through communication?
It's a combination. So you were right. In those first couple of months, it was terrible in terms of not expecting that to happen. I mean, we were under like a martial law, if you like, where the government stopped anyone moving in night hours. There are a couple of us that had to, because of the work that we were doing. I mean, I personally was heading down to brief the minister and what they call the prosecutor general, who was like, the head legal authority there. And the military had set up roadblocks, and they were very, very aggressive in their approach. I mean, I got pulled out of a car at gunpoint because I couldn't speak enough Teton, which is the local language. I learned as much as I could. They couldn't speak English. They didn't know who I was. I knew who they were. And I also knew that, often their ways of handling their weapons was quite scary. So when you get dragged out of a car at gunpoint, all of a sudden things come to perspective. We had a few of those incidents where that occurred. There was also the nervousness of not knowing if there would be a full-on collapse again and rioting occurred. So it's about managing expectations of the people that work for you, because one, you're a police officer, and two, you've got a dedicated job to do in a foreign country. You want to do your job, and they all wanted to do their work. And the hard part was keeping them away from that. And if a mind isn't busy, people can get into trouble.
Yeah.
So it was about pivoting in terms of what we needed to do. And from a leadership perspective, again, it became about the people. I was the buffer for Canberra. So, I tried to keep the political side away from what we were doing. But in particular, in those early days, I was also coming from Timor-Leste. It was coming from the United Nations. It was coming from the Portuguese. So it was coming from all different directions. But I found that communication is the best thing to do. If you're communicating with them constantly, letting them know what's going on, don't give them air to make up their own thoughts, because without the information that I had, that they would probably make incorrect decisions. So understanding the dangerous nature of it, the consequences, but also keeping them occupied was also a big thing. Like I said, you can't use, you can use all those leadership things that you're taught about in Australia, but they don't work very well in a post-conflict or a conflict zone.
So your deployments essentially had you touch into human nature, and that was a big part of what you had to do as a leader. But what did it also teach you about resilience and fear, especially?
The communities in those instances have an inherent distrust of, as I said, of police. What it taught me with human nature is people that come from an area like Timor was, that have been traumatised, it's very different. And if you don't understand the elements of trauma, it's very hard to be able to, I guess, calm their concerns down and to build the trust. And what I found about human nature is that if you do the unexpected and you do the things that help the community, you win the trust. You've heard of the hearts and minds metaphor. It's about winning over the hearts and minds, not winning over, look what we've been able to do to get your police ready. So we would have the guys, and I didn't come up with a lot of these. I asked them to come up themselves. So they would go and teach English of their own accord to young children of a weekend. We sponsored an orphanage up there. We actually held a fake Olympic Games opening because it was 2008 when the Olympics were on. And we worked with a number of NGOs that were providing support and things like that. So when you're out in the community doing that, the people see that and they appreciate that. And it lessens, I guess, one element of the trauma that they're going through.
They connected with you and you allowed them to feel part of your community, and you essentially became one community where it didn't feel like you came from two different cultures and two different countries.
That's right.
But essentially we're one people and we're all human beings essentially.
We are. And that can often be lost because you get so focused on what your outcomes are and what you're expected to do, because you're held to account not only by the organisation but also the politicians. And if you're not ticking those boxes, then it's perceived that you're not doing your job. I had numerous politicians come up, and I don't think any ever, even though we offered, were interested in going out to the community and seeing the things that we did. And that was not to promote what we did. That was to show the genuine interaction that you have with, little children coming up and hugging you, or hugging your leg and things like that. It's those moments that that you're making a difference. But in terms of the human nature, you also have to look at the opposite side. You look at the people that are disruptors that want to not have us succeed and things like that. And there were plenty out there to do that. But it's one of those, you can't stop that. You just manage it. And when I say by management, it was not giving them the air, not giving them the oxygen, not making mistakes, not being on the front page of the news, all those kind of things, because that's what they use to undermine
what you're doing,
what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think that separates what a good leader is versus a great leader, being able to connect with the people that you're working with within that community. Because if you can connect as people, at the end of the day, as a leader, you're trying to reach a goal. And if you can work as a joint unit, you would succeed a lot more than you would as an individual just trying to reach that goal on your own, isolated from the people that you're working for, essentially. Because even as a politician, you're serving the people. You need to be there on the ground too and understand what these people think, and in a way have those genuine interactions with them as well, so that they can connect to you and you can connect to them.
Correct.
So it's a really good point that you brought up, because it just shows what your leadership look like and the importance of being a great leader and being able to connect with people on the ground too, not just see things from the outside.
But it was also internal. At that time, the AFP was really going through a growth process. So the government had given money to form this IDG, the International Deployment Group, and they were really the guys and girls that would come sign on for, I think, 4 years and would do deployments around all the places where the AFP had missions. That upset some of the people that had joined the AFP from the beginning, and there was a fracture in the culture because I started to hear these things about retreads, which they would refer to the people coming through, or the blue bloods, which were the ones that were born and blue AFP, and that's dangerous. It's dangerous when you're in Australia. It's dangerous when you're overseas as well. We also have, within the policing culture of the AFP, you have the sworn, the gun-carrying people, and you have the non-sworn, the people that don't have powers. And we had quite a few unsworn people there. And sometimes certain individuals would look down upon them because they believed that they were just there to support them. They were, but they weren't there to do everything for them. So you're managing all these nuances within your own team as well. And as far as I'm concerned, my ultimate message was, I don't care where you come from. I don't care, what you think in terms of how it is. You sign on to the AFP, you sign on. And I never, even through my whole career, I never considered that difference between the non-sworn and the sworn. considered we were all the same. There were different pressures, there were different things that we did. And as soon as we could get the people thinking about that, the less worry we had about the nitpicking and the carrying on and the snide marks and all that.
Yeah.
It's unnecessary. It just detracts from what you're trying to do.
Agreed. And it speaks to who you were as a leader too. Now, I want to dive into your time in the Americas. So as the AFP's most senior officer based in Washington, you were dealing with the biggest law enforcement agencies around the world. You were effectively representing Australian law enforcement across the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central and South America. So that was an enormous geopolitical responsibility. How did you prepare for that role and the pressure that comes along with that too, and representing Australia at that level as well?
I was fortunate. By the time I got to that position, I'd already done Afghanistan, I'd done Timor, I'd done 3 years in Los Angeles back in the 90s, and I'd also lived in Hawaii for 2 years. So I had a pretty good understanding of the American culture, societally, but also from a law enforcement policing side. You'll notice I flipped from policing to law enforcement because, in particular, that's what the Americans do. They're not all police; they're law enforcement. So, a lot of the cities and have like LAPD, NYPD, but then you have others that are law enforcement. So they might be the Department of Justice, they call it that. That's why I flip between the two terms. What I used to say to people, or I should say how I prepared, I already knew before I went there that I was looking at somewhere around 18,000 plus law enforcement agencies in the US alone. And many of them have crossover jurisdictions, and you have to understand the breakdown. So you have to work from the federal level, so like the FBI, the DEA, etc. You got to come down to the state level. So you have your NYPDs, LAPDs, and then you have your provincials. I mean, there are some counties there that have a sheriff, one person.
Wow.
But they're considered as a law enforcement agency, even though they've only got one person. And then you've got like, the NYPD that have got, I think, 60,000. And that's the breadth and the spread. And often what I found, certainly early on in my days in the 90s, is that there was so much disconnection because it's kind of a natural phenomenon with police of patch protection. I mean, we still have it here in Australia. Knowledge is information is knowledge, and we don't share. We're much better these days, and the US were much better after 9/11 because they had to be, because they realised that not through 9/11, if they had have shared the information and picked up all the tiny bits, they would have been able to find out that there was a terrorist attack coming. So understanding the law enforcement is the hardest part for a start. Understanding where to go, understanding how to approach it, because the Americans would struggle to put us into a pocket because we went federal. We did some state things, we did a whole bunch, and I had to use the example where the AFP is probably closest to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they can make that connection with that, because what you find is, depending where you go, if someone said you like the FBI, you could say yes, but at the same time that will annoy someone else because they've had a bad interaction with the FBI.
Right, okay.
You could say the same about the DEA, the Secret Service, because the AFP does all of that.
Yeah.
So understanding that first was the hardest part. But then in my role, it was over and above that. It was, it almost become, to a degree, pseudo-political, because everything that you do has a political element when you're working offshore. So in fact, we hold diplomatic status. So I had a diplomatic passport. All the guys that were with me had diplomatic passports. It gives you certain privileges, but it also there's a lot more expectation.
Yeah.
And for me, I had multiple masters. I had the masters back home, but then I also had the ambassadors. I had, when I first got there, I had Kim Beasley, and then Joe Hockey came in. Now they're great. They didn't want to control me. But I know a number of times, in particular with Joe, I'd get called to his office and he'd say, "This is a cop thing. I need you to deal with this." He's got it. It already comes with a political element. So, you've got to start to think a little more like that.
Yep.
I mean, I did never want to be a politician, but you had that responsibility. And sometimes in policing, you have to do things that run against your core values.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that was mine, but what I found was that I had to tread very carefully, and I was also very cautious about, having the guys that work for me getting into some of those roles, because it was unfair on them.
Yeah.
They were there for specific
Mm-hmm.
roles. So preparing yourself for all that, understanding how the political, machinations work, because more than once I would get a question, so are you Trump or Obama, when I first got to Washington, and you had to canvass that very carefully. The big one was guns. So the US, the two systems that we operate under are very different, but we used to say it same, but different. So it looks same for people that watch the television. They think, it's kind of the same, but it's not. The political systems are very, very different, and the fact that, say, using the gun, the amendment situation, we don't have that. Those like the Bill of Rights, etc. And firearms were always a touchy issue, because you were asked, you might not know what that person, where they thought.
Yeah. And
the vast majority couldn't understand why we bought, we had the gun buyback after Port Arthur. I had to explain, go back that far, you'd have to explain that. You'd have to explain that, Australia has a very difficult situation. But then they'd say, so what happens, what happens when there's a takeover of the government, when some people come in? Because
they look at it that way, because they have a lot of shootings that they struggle with too, but they always push back against pulling back the guns. Yeah,
because the Second Amendment came from that, basically, when the British came over. That's what but the Second Amendment was also brought in when they had flintstocks, one shot, and then it would take you forever to reload, not the semi-automatics, not the whatever. And the politics of the NRA, etc., over there has huge influence on the politics of that. I mean, I used to say it's like the genie's out of the bottle; you can never stuff it back in. And there are genuinely many people that don't want to have guns there, but they are the minority, and there is that expectation there that as a card carrying citizen of the US, you have the right to hold firearms. That made it very difficult in terms of the continual amount of mass murders, and we don't hear them all in Australia. I mean, every other day there's a mass casualty shooting in the US. It's only the real big ones, or the ones that involve children, etc., that make the media. So understanding how to answer things, to be able to use language which sort of didn't put you in a definitive position, because often it's very hard to defend.
Yeah.
And again, that's that whole issue of probably having to. I mean, I like guns as a sport, but I don't think people should be allowed to
have access to them all the time. Yeah.
And I mean, when I first heard over there about the ghost guns in 2015, they hadn't reached here, and the number of. Are you familiar what ghost guns are?
No.
Okay. So what a ghost gun is, they're essentially 3D printer. They call them ghost guns because they don't have any serial numbers. So anybody in the US can use a 3D printer to make the stock, if you like, of the gun. Under the law, it doesn't become a gun until you put the actual firing components in.
Okay.
So this is how they were getting around it. And this is how organised crime are using it now, where you print these up, you use these guns, they're untraceable, and often people will use them and get rid of them because they're so cheap to make.
Okay.
So it only becomes a gun under the US law when you put the two components together. It's a little bit different here in Australia. And the reason I raise that is statistics talk about nearly 500,000 guns in the country. That's way more than the population, but that's 500,000 guns that they know that are there.
Okay.
It's not the ones that they don't know.
Because I was going to say, I haven't heard about the ghost guns before. Yeah. So it's not something very widely popular on the media.
Not really. It's only really started to raise its head here recently. And the reason why is because our laws are stricter.
Yep.
But the guy in the US that come up with this, I can't remember his name now, he would put all the instructions on the internet how to make them. So all you needed was a 3D printer. You can make the stock of and I'm talking from a handgun right the way through to a semi-automatic.
Okay.
And then all you need to do is get the components that turn it into a gun. Well, they're even making those now. Yeah. So the firing pins and the mechanisms to do that for one shot guns, and assemble them. And he, I'm not encouraging people to go out and search for it, but as far as I know, those instructions are still on the internet, so it's not hard to do. I mean, children were making them.
Yep.
That's frightening.
So it was definitely a lot different, the culture in America versus Australia, navigating that.
Yeah.
Making decisions over there, you spoke about how there was geopolitical responsibilities that came along with it. Did that mean that you had to take decisions that had geopolitical consequences?
Yes.
Just not
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did that feel?
Look, I mean, I knew it was part of the job, but what I was more concerned about, and what annoyed me more, was being asked to do things that I knew that had a geopolitical, didn't quite have one, or turned out to have one. Because I'll give you an example. I was tasked with going down to the what they call the Northern Triangle in Central America. So it's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador.
Yep.
And I was asked to go down there to do an assessment on those three countries. Now, the first thing that raised a concern for me was, why are we doing this? We don't have trade. We don't have. There's no reason for us, for the AFP, that I could see. But I was told that we needed to just to have an assessment because of that was around the really rising time of MS-13. Are you familiar with that group?
The name sounds familiar, but let's
so
go through.
MS-13 is basically the most notorious gang group in America.
Okay.
Mostly Guatemalans, mostly immigrants or illegal immigrants coming up. It's part of you'll often hear Trump talk about that when he wants to stop the immigration and build a wall.
Yeah, he does.
Send bucket loads of people back. Well, a lot of them are MS-13, and the actual MS-13 was born in the US, or in Los Angeles. Very, very violent, very, very nasty gang. So that was the reason that I was given to go down and do that, but also to talk to the police about, capacity building. What kind of things did they need? So I did all that, and I was under immense pressure, time pressure. So that all automatically said to me, something's happening that's time sensitive, that I need to do this.
Yeah, okay.
So I did. I went down. I did everything that was required of me. I mean, they're dangerous places. I mean, I had people outside my hotel room. I went in armoured cars everywhere. Then I heard on the news that Australia and the US were striking a deal. This would have been around maybe 2016 or 2017. It was to do with the people smuggling, where the US were going to take certain nations that had come to Australia that Australia wasn't to go in, and in return we would take people from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Okay. And that was the purpose behind doing that. Now, in policing and international everywhere, but truth is a currency. As soon as people lose faith in what you're saying, word gets around really quickly, and that doesn't allow you to do the other main currency, which is relationships. So they're the two things that are important when you're dealing in policing, but also in that part of the world. And I got very annoyed because I went down there and told them lies, not deliberately. I didn't, but they wouldn't understand that. Yeah. And the other piece that the geopolitical side of it all is that they had three countries now that the AFP had gone down and gave the opinion that we were going to help them, and we didn't. Yeah. And that sort of stuck with me. Yeah. And when I questioned it with the leaders back home, they just said, look, it was cabinet sensitivity, cabinet in conference, couldn't say anything. And I'm like, I mean, I could have been brought into that and told that's the reason why. Yeah. Yeah.
It definitely was a lot more than operational strategy from the things.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just one example. There are many, many more, but that's the one that was most complicated, because I knew from the start something wasn't right. But I didn't know because, it wasn't in the media. I weren't brought
the
into
discussions were. Yeah. And I think things could be a lot more efficient when everyone is aware of what's going on, because then you can reach that same goal. I mean, it circles back to what I said earlier about being a great leader and having everyone on the same page.
Yeah.
So it's definitely one of those learning points that I think every leader can take on board and see how they can put, be self-accountable and see how they can apply that to themselves.
I mean, I had a similar situation with Joe Hockey. So when the AOP deals with, in particular with the child exploitation, we work very closely with a place called NECMEC, which is in Virginia, just out of Washington. It's the National Child Exploitation. I can't even think of the acronym now. Very, very big, and they're the ones that triage all the Australians that access child porn online. I think now we're up to over 20,000 referrals a year just in Australia, but they sanitize it so that we get just the worst ones. But Joe Hockey had asked me, he actually even said to me, I don't even know what the AFP does. Now, that's the guy that was the treasurer of Australia. Yeah. And for him to say, I don't know exactly what you do, and you know, there's reasons why that happened. We went into that. But I said to him, look, how about, I mean, you know, I introduced him to some of the people. I brought some of the higher people in from the FBI and things like that. But I said, the real thing you probably should go and see is out at NECMEC and get a presentation. And he said, I'm up for that. And we took him out. And when you take people to NECMEC, they will ask you, do you want like the full standard one, or you want just the nice? I said, no, give him the whole lot. And I remember after the presentation, you know, he sat there and he just put his hands on the table and just hit his head. He said, why aren't we doing anything about this? Why don't we have something like this in Australia? Yeah. You know, he said, I'm going to make calls. I'm going to make calls. We need to get funding on this. I'm going to talk to Peter Dutton or whoever it was at the time. We're going to make this happen. I'm like, oh no, please don't, don't do that. He goes, no. He said, I can't sit by and see that happen. And I thought, oh no, that was a strategic faux pas on my behalf, because I didn't know that. I called back to Canberra and I said, look, this is what I did today, but this is the outcome of it. That prickled a lot of people back there. And, you know, I got told I shouldn't have done that. Why did I do that? And I said, well, you know, he's an ambassador. He wants to know what we're doing. I think it's a good thing, you know. And then they told me, they said, look, there's things happening back here that you don't know about. And I said, well, if I don't know about it, how can I get around this? And they said, well, it's, you know, you don't need to know about it. And I said, I don't even know what it is we're talking about. And then they told me that there was a proposal going forward to set up an Australian coordination centre, which they have since up here in Brisbane for all that. But I didn't know that. And they told me to tell Joe Hockey to cool his jets. And I said, I don't say that to an ambassador. That needs to come from someone a little higher up, you know. Those kind of things really annoy you, because, as I've always said, you don't know what you don't know. Yep. You either can't change, or you can't stop, or you can't maneuver things.
You mentioned that you'd worked with the higher levels up in the FBI as well. Do you think that was a similar issue that they faced up there as well, where not everyone is brought into the conversations that need to be brought into, and then it just causes roadblocks along the way?
It's very problematic in the US. You know, aside to directly answer your question, yes, the FBI are very siloed in the way that they do their work. And when I say that, there's like walls, and some of them are physical walls now between areas, and they don't talk unless they absolutely have to. But in terms of trickle-down decision-making, or decision-making on the way up, it's very difficult. There are so many layers they have to go through, which slows them down. Giving an instance, you know, when there was a terrorist incident and we were needing to get information from the FBI, it would take sometimes days. We would find out mostly about it from the media than we did from them. But more broadly across the US, like I said, they realised after 9/11 that they needed to do something about this. So these fusion cells started to happen, where you would have these areas of central activity where departments would put people in. Okay. So you would have,
it's like a working group.
Yeah, and that's what I call it, a fusion centre. So it's depending on where it is in the country, and at what level as well. But that was the way to try and stop this activity happening. Look, sometimes, mostly it wasn't nefarious. It was just that people didn't think, because they come from a particular area. Well, okay, I know that. Never dealt with the broader picture and don't know. But it's we still had that problem to a degree in Australia as well. not as bad, but we do have that problem. And that comes back to that human nature element.
Yeah, I was going to say
And it depends on the individual, it depends on the organisation.
Yeah.
But sometimes getting the information that you needed in a timely manner was difficult. And then I had other mechanisms to get information, and I could get it very quickly. But then that would ruffle the feathers of, say, the FBI or the DEA, because we're not supposed to go with that. We're supposed to go through them, you know. And I'm like, well, can't go through you. Well, I can go through you, but I can get it within 24 hours. And again, that comes back to what you know and how you can, I guess, not manipulate the system, but manipulate how you
It's
get
managing
the information.
politics between law enforcement agencies, essentially.
And that comes back to that relationship, and it comes back to that trust.
Yeah. A lot of relationship building. That definitely, from what you've said, it sounds like it was definitely not an operational role. A lot of relationship building, very much political, but it comes with the responsibilities that you had. Again, you're the most senior officer in the Americas. You were in Washington, D.C. It's one of the most important roles someone can have, especially in the AFP. You were representing Australia over there. So with that responsibility, there would have been a lot more challenges that you would have had to face as a leader. Yeah,
and that's why I tried to sort of buffer any of that problem from the guys that work for me, because those guys were there specifically to be involved in operational activity. Not hands-on, but
of course,
making sure the information.
A lot of the strategy around what you were doing in the AFP, but operational and I guess isolated from the very top, which is who you had to deal with and manage the politics around that. Now, I want to talk about your strength achievements that you've done. So you became Australia's strongest man and competed at the world's strongest man while simultaneously carrying the pressure of policing. Did strength become part of your identity, or was it a protection mechanism?
It was both, but it was there long before I joined the AFP.
Yeah.
So in particular with sport, I mean, I never started doing the strongman until I think it was 1996 when I first moved to Canberra. But in my younger years, I was like, most boys, I tried a little bit of everything. I wasn't great at things, but I was okay. And I was looking for an identity and a purpose, and I couldn't find it. I'm not saying that that's how my mind was thinking at the time. I know now that that's what I was looking for.
Yeah. Okay.
And that coincides with exactly what it's like when you're in police. You have an identity that's given to you. The purpose is something that you generate yourself. That's how it could be one of a number of things. But I was searching for that as a young kid. And I had a bit of a dysfunctional childhood, so it sort of complicated things. And personally, I needed to be seen as an act with strength, not physical strength, more strength of character. Come from a single parent family. I hadn't, my sister, but my mother and father split in the 60s, and that just didn't happen back in those days.
Okay.
My father was gay. That's why they split. That was not acceptable back
during that time.
It was a criminal offence to be homosexual in those days.
Okay.
But then my mother, became dependent on alcohol because of the breakdown of the marriage and things, and she ended up passing away at a reasonably young age because of that. But I bore the burden as the protector of the family. My mother said to me, "You're the man of the house." I think I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. I didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
So I was looking for a purpose and an identity, and sport would eventually give me that. And I was very fortunate. I was able to represent my country in track and field. I mean, we qualified for the Olympics in bobsled as well. I did powerlifting. I did Scottish Highland Games, but it was the strength stuff. And yes, to answer you, that was a long way to answer your question.
No, it was great to hear about it.
But yes, it was, but it wasn't a conscious thing back then. I certainly saw a difference between physical strength, emotional strength, psychological strength, and things like that. But what it did is it almost gave me an alter ego. When I say I had two personalities, because I did, I had the strongman. And in fact, I remember previous Commissioner Mick Kilty, he would always introduce me first, not as Grant, the detective, or whatever rank I had. This is Grant, he's a strong man, he pulls stuff.
Australia's strongest man.
Yeah. And then follow it. He pulls stuff, and that was how I would be introduced.
Yeah.
Look, I didn't mind that. I wore it as a badge of honour, but sometimes I thought, oh wow, geez, it degraded my, the idea of me having policing skills and things like that. And it was very hard to work the two in.
Yeah. Instead of being introduced as Commander Grant Edwards, it was
that
the
became,
guy that pulls stuff.
Yeah, that became later once I retired, but that would always follow me. In fact, I did, to raise mental health awareness, I came out of retirement when I was in the US and pulled a US Air Force Globe Master to raise awareness for that.
And that's a military aircraft, for those that don't know what that is. Yeah. And it was 178 ton.
Yeah,
that was
something like that. Yeah. The strength became my protector, but it also kind of hindered me as well. And when I say it hindered me, yes, I was seen as big, strong. I now, after I had my issues with mental health, people would say, "Oh, we never expect that. We didn't even know that." Because I was the embodiment of size, strength. I could do stuff, but there were things that were happening inside me that one, I didn't know, and two, I couldn't control. And that's what I mean. It can be a hindrance because the policing culture is tough enough, as I said, in talking about the mental health. But when I was first told that I had PTSD, I didn't want to hear it because I thought that was the end of my career. And that was not long before I was going to America. And I struggled with the whole idea. I struggled with that idea is that, no, we're police. We run into places when people run out of places. It's almost acceptable now that you can be abused, you can be spat at, you can do all that kind of stuff. You have that shield of resilience.
Yeah.
And they're help-seeking behaviours that a lot of police don't have. We don't want to do that, and that's exactly how I was thinking. And that's how that was the hindrance element of it, because I kept cycling back to that. I was more worried about what would people think. Not in a egotistical way. It was more like I don't know how to address that. So I just kept ignoring it, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. So yes, it helped me, but it also became a hindrance as well.
Yeah. It's a really interesting juxtaposition because you were seen as a top level elite athlete. You were an Olympics qualifier. You were known as Australia's strongest man. You were featured in the World Guinness records as well. The puller, you pulled like the locomotives, so like the train rails, the aircraft. You use strength as a way to actually highlight the importance of mental health in the policing culture. So it's that juxtaposition that's quite interesting, because you made it seem that it's not a weakness. Mental health is important, and you're not weak as an individual if in some way you're traumatized or you're struggling mentally or psychologically from the physical strain that comes from being in the police.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, look, I didn't aim for that to happen. That just happened naturally. I mean, a lot of what happened in my life, so that I wasn't chasing it. And how that all came about, I mean, people knew that I'd done those things. But what happened in 2017, and this is when I was in Washington, the AFP unfortunately had a number of suicides and most of the people that took their lives during that sort of horrible period I knew. And I'm watching it from afar, and I could see what was going on. There was a lot of negative media towards the AFP, and I said to my wife, I said, look, maybe if I send an email out and I can just say to people and be honest, and because part of leadership is vulnerability as well, and a lot of leaders refuse to be vulnerable because they believe that by being vulnerable they show weakness. It's quite the opposite. You don't want to be completely vulnerable because then people will go, hang on a minute, how did he ever get or she get this job? But when I say vulnerable, it's about just show your emotions. Just say something simple like, I had a crappy weekend, my dog got hit by a car, and our family are struggling.
Just so that people can relate to you. As a leader.
And I said that to my wife, and she said, well, you're prepared for what might come of it. And I said, look, that's the least of my worries. So I ended up speaking with the commissioner, and I asked him if he thought it was okay, and he did. And I sent an email out I now remember it was March 2017, and I basically laid out what had been happening to me that very few people knew about because I didn't go public with it. But those suicides really hit a nerve for me. I mean, I'd lost good friends previously from suicide, but it was almost for a period an epidemic. And it wasn't that they were taking their lives; they were taking their lives in a police facility with most of them with a police issue weapon. So I did that email, and mostly it was really well received. That wasn't my concern. It was more about saying, we need to look after each other better. And I was very honest. I said, have the AFP done this right? No, they haven't. Could we do better? Yes, we could. Because I don't believe in sugarcoating those kind of things. And then what happened from that? The Canberra Times got a hold of it, and next thing I had a journalist calling me saying, "Hey, we've seen this email. Are you happy to do all this?" And they were, and they did that. And then on the back of that, the Australian Story picked that up. And we ended up doing an Australian, if you're familiar with Australian Story, ended up doing
and you did
that.
a piece with them.
Yeah. So I had never envisaged, going down that pathway.
Yeah.
I thought I did the email. I did.
And that was it.
What I could. Yeah. But using the strength part of it, and when I did the Australian Story, I was nervous because they said to me, "We want to title it The Strong Man," and I said, "No, that's gonna diminish the whole idea." And I went straight to, like, are you familiar with Hey It's Saturday? Do you remember that show?
No.
Probably not. No, you don't. It was iconic.
Before my time.
Yeah. Daryl Summers used to run it. We appeared on that, and it was all fun and frivolity. Because that's what the show was about. We're sort of mocking the strong man, and I thought, no, I don't want. That's going to diminish.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until the producer said to me, no, that's a brilliant backstory because we want to, like you said, show that juxtaposition between you as a physically strong person, and that shows people that it can happen to anybody. And I said, well, yeah, okay, I understand that, and I was nervous, but that's how that came about. And then, I guess the rest is history in that regard.
You then went on and wrote a memoir called The Strong Man. Is that what motivated you to finally open up about the cost of the journey?
Not originally. So after the Australian Story aired, and remember, I was in the US, I started getting calls from publishers saying that'd be a good book. Can you do that? Would you like to do that? And I said, look, I'm in America at the moment. I said, I don't even know, how do you do that? How do I do that? And they said, oh, well, can you write it? And I said, I don't have time. I mean, I'm working across 2 time zones. I've got no time to do that. And they said, well, what about if we get a ghostwriter? And I said, explain that. And they explained it to me. And I said, well, how do you propose to do that while I'm here? Well, we'll find someone maybe in America. And I said, well, are they going to understand the nuances of Australia? Anyway, it became too difficult. And so I parked it. And it wasn't until I'd moved back to Australia, I'd finished my posting, a good friend of mine, or his brother actually, from school. He was a writer, and he approached me and he said, I'd really like to help you with this. Now, I trusted him because I knew the family well. I knew him. And when we talked about it, and I wanted to know what angle we were going to take on it, and how it was. And it was essentially a memoir, not just of the strong man. I don't know if you've seen the cover. It's the strong man, but it's me in Afghanistan on what they call Swimming Pool Hill in my uniform to show that whole juxtaposition. And yes, once we went through that process, then I was, because I said to Daniel, who helped me write it, I said, if I'm going to do this, it's got to be transparent. I'm not going to hide behind the thing. So we agreed that it'd be like a warts and all type thing to show how, not necessarily how I got to be where I was, but to give people that are reading an idea of the complexities of people that we don't often know about. Yeah. And I think Robin Williams, the comedian, unfortunately he passed away, but he said that. He said, we should always be nice to people because we never know when we're talking to someone what they're going through. And I know that more than I ever thought now. We all go through our own trials and tribulations. Yeah. And that's very important. But I've just written the second one actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this
Memoir as well.
Yeah, but it's different. It's about not so much my life. It's about how I came to be where I was. So it's more a combination of the things in policing that impacted me and my mental health journey through. So that it's called When the Light Dims, because that's what it feels like when you start to go. You have things going wrong.
Yeah.
The bright light no longer exists. It just gets dimmer and dimmer, like when a candle goes out.
Yeah.
And the idea is never to let it go out.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I believe in the more that we tell stories with this, the more open that we can be. And this is not in terms of writing books. It's in the workplace. Don't be afraid to say,
because you can reach other people. Some people struggle quietly, and sometimes it can be too late by that point when you realize that they needed help. So if you can be vocal about your story, it can actually help someone else.
Yeah, and it's important that people know that it's actually okay not to be okay. I mean, you hear that a lot in the mental health, but it is. But when you're in the moment, the world narrows, and you think that all of a sudden you become the odd one out, but you're not. There's so many people in the same position, but it takes a bit to be able to come to that realization that one, I need help, and I need to ask for help.
Yeah. I mean, you were seen as impossible to break, an international police commander, a strong man, but at the same time, you were able to come out to the public and say, I have struggled too. Was that difficult, do you think, being able to admit that to everyone?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I refused to it at first. My doctor knew, my wife knew, but they, and rightly so. You've got to pick the right time, and unfortunately, it's almost you've got to wait for that right moment. So I use the example with my mother. So she ended up having renal failure because of the amount of alcohol she was drinking. I tried for years to stop her, and I couldn't. The day that she acknowledged that she had a problem and she wanted to turn her life around was the night before she died.
Yeah,
it's too, and sometimes that happens, unfortunately. But the thing is, it takes the individual like a cathartic moment or something to happen when they realise, no, I can't keep living like this. And the idea is to help people get to that space before, they go too far. And they take their own life. It's not an easy thing to deal with. Mental health, it's a very difficult process to navigate through, because we're not taught it.
Yeah.
We are getting better.
And years ago, it was seen as a weakness. I mean, slowly people are opening up about it now, and the generations have changed where people are a lot more inquisitive about what mental health is like and how we can keep it good and taken care of. But years ago, it would have been a lot more difficult to struggle and not be able to voice it out loud because it's seen as a weakness.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, I guess, why the whole strong thing, because initially I spoke of it as a weakness, and I very quickly changed my language when I realised, I said, no, it's actually a strength. It's a strength to be able to come out and go, I need help.
Yeah.
I need help. Someone help me. I'm not well.
And it speaks to your resilience too, because you were struggling. You were able to be self-aware enough to realise, I'm going down a deep, dark hole. And you stopped there, and you were resilient enough to try to climb out of that hole and actually get out of that dim world that you were in and brighten that light. Because I think it's a lot easier to say, I'm struggling, but the effort that goes into trying to come out of that dark moment is actually really hard. You can have moments where you can't get out of bed. PTSD, I can't imagine what that would be like, having to have nightmares from the days that you've had. Being able to move on from that, and the effort that goes into uplifting yourself and working on yourself to grow, it's a lot of commitment, and it speaks to how much you've done as an individual to grow, and you've been resilient enough to work through that.
Yeah, it is. And the key point of all this is, when somebody in a position of what we're discussing decides to come out, they'll confide in someone. It may be a family member, it might not. In my case, it wasn't initially, but what that individual does or says in that moment is critical, because if the individual gets the wrong message or the person doesn't know how to handle it, That might be the one and only chance where they wanted to, because if it comes out not how they expect, that will just reinforce what they think. You know, I can't tell anybody this because, you know, it's kind of like, oh, well, what do you want me to do? Or, oh, you'll be okay. You know, we all go through that. That kind of stuff just doesn't sit, you know, and that's where listening is most important. And the best question that you can ask somebody is, what can I do to help you with this? You know, you know, you might say that with your fingers crossed behind the back because you don't know what to do. Yeah. But at least you keep that conversation open.
Be as supportive as you can.
That's right. Yeah. And it's their journey, you know. You don't want to be trying to tell them what to do. You don't want them to become dependent upon you. It's just like, okay, well, let's talk about this. What can I do to help you with this? You know, tell me as much as you want, or as much as you don't want. We can do it now, we can do it later, but you keep that door open, and then slowly that builds the confidence.
You in the book talk about reaching breaking point after surviving a deadly attack in Kabul. What was that like for you?
At the time I didn't know it. You know, you know when you go over there that you expect, you know, there's a chance that things are going to happen, and there were a lot of close calls. It actually didn't happen in the moment. It started to occur when I got back to Australia, and I now know why that happened. But especially in policing, it's never really one moment. It can be, but it's more an accumulation. I use the analogy, and there's lots of analogies about, you know, the day you start the job, you're given a backpack, and every day you go to work, you put a pebble in it. You know, first 5 years, no, you're young, you're strong, you can carry it. 10 years gets a little bit heavy. 15, it's like, oh my God, you know, 20 years you start to drag it, and you get to 30 years and there's no more room left. Something's got to give. And that's what happens, you know, because you can be as resilient as you want, but the more that you're exposed to, the human body's not, and mind is not meant to experience, you know, so much trauma, so many things going on. And I'm not just talking about the trauma of the job of seeing a dead body, or, you know, dealing with a rape victim or a child that's been exploited. Sometimes it's a trauma of the workforce, and a lot of it is what happens in the workforce. Your bullying, your sexual harassment, you know, all those kind of things. And we don't associate that with trauma, and that's why it gets difficult for some people to rationalise. Well, hang on a minute, you've never seen anything like that. You don't, why are you traumatised? Yeah, traumatised is about the individual. You know, it's not a nice, neat pathway that you go down. So for me, so to give you context, when I was in Timor, I contracted dengue fever and chikungunya, if you know what those two are. When I was in Afghanistan, I contracted schistosomiasis, which is another parasite. Okay. Basically, I guess my initial collapse was psychological, but then there was a second one in 2022 where I ended up being diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And chronic fatigue syndrome is it's a whole bunch of things. They don't know why, but it comes under that. Yeah, okay. So I was operating on two fronts for a long period of time. But the psychological event happened because I'd only been back a week. I went down to my park, the local school where I trained, and I heard gunfire, or what I interpreted to be gunfire. And reacted like I did when it happened in Afghanistan, where, you know, you hit the ground and you do all that. But my body was reacting like I was back in Afghanistan, but my mind was saying, no, Grant, hang on a minute, you're all back home in Australia. Long story short, I was able to identify that it was the school holidays, and it was not paintball, the other bunch of,
like the Nerf guns?
Yeah, the one, but it sounded like it was an automatic, which so that
your mind went back to how it was.
Yeah, and then you know, I spoke to the psychologist at the AFP, and they just sort of said, "Oh, it's okay. That's just hypervigilance. You'll get over that." Not kind of answer that I was looking for. And like I said, you know, when you talk to, you'd think from a professional, you'd have a different perspective. Yeah. And then that's how it started. You know, I started my behaviour. When I say my behaviour, you know, I started drinking. Drinking is not a friend of my family. I started to be very distant with my young daughter and my wife. And none of this is what you do consciously. Hypervigilance, you know, react quickly. You get very angry quickly. and you start having the nightmares.
Yeah.
Thankfully now I don't have them as much, but they still come every now and then. But I just thought that was because I was there and I was getting older, and I kept trying. I found every way to dismiss it.
I mean, it sounds from a lot of what you've done, it was a lot less from your typical police role, more military. So during your time there in Afghanistan, so you pretty much work closely with Australian and international defence forces then, I would assume. What was that relationship like then on the ground? Were you in situations similar to how you would see, like in the movies, you used to just see it as black and white, you see soldiers out there. And so was that the way it was for you?
It was different because so most of the kinetic military action by Australia was in Tarin Kowt down in Uruzgan province, which was at the south of Afghanistan.
So that's where the soldiers were?
Yeah, and that's where most of the AFP people were there down there working, training the police in that province, because that was how it was divided up amongst all the varying contributing countries. I also had people in Kandahar, which was where the main Air Force base was for the US and for a majority of the nations. And then I had the bulk of people, or not the bulk of people, but the next lot with me in Kabul, because we were working with what was called the International Police Coordination Board. Now, this goes to the point. It's always been a struggle. The military can intervene, and they're very, very good at reclaiming the land, getting everything sorted. Unfortunately, what happened in Afghanistan, and we've seen it happen in other places, because of the violence and the nature, then they tend to try, they have no choice. They get into police building, because you have to take, the vacuum occurs when, for instance, the Taliban is moved out, or, whatever the regime is that you've turned over, like in Iraq or things like that. But if you don't fill that vacuum quickly, that's when organised crime comes in. And we had the military training the police, basically like military officers, and it doesn't work. So it took a number of years before, if you like, the heads of ISAF over there decided, no, we need to get the police in. So they brought the police in, which is good. But what happened is they brought police in from all around the world. So you had Australia doing what Australia knew. You had Germans doing what Germans do. You had all the other countries, because you only know what your country. So the Afghan police were getting taught a gazillion different ways to do things, and it wasn't one unified component. The other part is that it was very hard to attract people into the police, because the military, as I said earlier, they hold the higher
status,
the status, and the Americans gave a very, very ambitious target of wanting to get up to 120 or 130,000 police really quickly. So what they did is they made their training courses 3 weeks, gave them a gun and said, go out and do this. Nowhere near enough time. And what a lot of people don't realise is that there were many police slaughtered by the Taliban, because they just didn't have the skills, the capability, or the material that they needed to do that. In fact, President Karzai at the time, he declared he never wanted to give agency to the Taliban, so he declared that they were a criminal organisation, not a terrorist organisation, which meant that as a criminal organisation, it's the police has control of that. But they were nowhere, fit to do that. And I went over as the deputy head of the International Coordination Board. It was headed by a diplomat, a former diplomat, and the idea was to start to coordinate all that. Unfortunately, it had been happening in a reduced capacity, but we just started to get things going where in 2013 I got the phone call saying that the Afghans aren't going to renew your MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, which would mean that we would have to leave.
Yeah.
You talk about a geopolitical problem, that became a huge issue. And I know we haven't got time to talk about it today, but that was a very, very difficult period trying to do that. But what we were trying to do was to coordinate all the countries, but also coordinate the countries, not to train them in one program, but to let the Afghans tell us what they needed. Same as we did with the Timorese, because it's human nature that we go and think we know everything. When we build a program, it doesn't work for them because it doesn't fit their way of doing business.
Yeah.
So we started up. We got a whole lot of Afghan generals together, and we asked them or helped them identify what are the 8 main areas that you need to do, and then we started working with them, and they would tell us how it in their culture, how it gets done, what they need, simple things of difference in language, little things like that, but also, how would it fit their environment and what they were having to deal with the Taliban. This was before the big withdrawal started.
Yeah. Okay.
And then unfortunately, the AFP left in 2014, other countries left, and it really kind of never got any further. I mean, we got the whole program signed off right up to, to the Ministry of Interior and everything, and they were in the process of starting to implement that when we left.
Yeah.
And others started to leave as well, and now,
it's a lot different.
It's a lot different. Yeah.
Reflecting on your career then, on all of what you've done, how did it feel receiving an Australian Police Medal?
Unexpected, and that's rightly so, because you don't know. And I mean, when I got it, or when I was aware that I was getting it, because I got it for, I think from memory, it was for contributions to international policing and things like that. I was humbled that I got it, but I also struggled with the idea that, look, I'm just one person in the machine. I mean, I had to reconcile it in my mind by saying, well, this is, thank you to all the people that worked with me and the great teams that I was with, the work that we did collectively. And that's the hardest part when you get recognised as an individual, because you know that, and I always say, I was only as good as the people that I got. In fact, I used to say, I'm so glad I got these people because they make me look good, and that's the hard part. But it's something that is, a lot of people, I mean, don't get that opportunity. And I didn't want to turn it into a negative thing, a positive thing, but I feel there are many people equally as deserving than I was. But I tried to make it about, yes, I'm honoured that I got it, but I only got it because of the good people that worked with me to allow me to do what I needed to do.
You're only one small part to a bigger piece, bigger puzzle.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to, though, who you were as a leader as well. So what would be your most proudest moment when you reflect back on all of that? And this is also looking at the fact that you held positions that very few people did have. So what did you feel like you would be most proud of?
That's a really difficult question, because there are so many things. If I look at it in isolation, you talked about the trafficking. I mean, that was a wild ride, and I was proud that I was able to be one of the people that begun that. But I remember back to my early days where we were, taking vast shipments of drugs off the streets and things like that, when the heroin epidemic, for instance, was at its height. But then I look at, with the child exploitation and having to sit there and watch video after video of children being brutally assaulted, sexually assaulted by people, not being able to reconcile how a human can do that, to my time in Afghanistan. I mean, when I got back, I got asked, what's the hardest thing you've ever done in the job? And I said, this one, because people's lives were on line. Not every day police get to work in a war. But I guess if I were to look at that across the board, I think that what I feel proudest of were the people that were able to help get to where they wanted to get, and giving them the confidence to be able to operate outside of their comfort zone, encouraging them to operate out of their comfort zone, seeing them, move through the ranks, because that's it's like a coach, it's something that really gets you when you see, your athlete do really well. And I always use sporting metaphors. I used to drive my guys nuts because we'd have a meet and I'd talk about, these sports heroes, and half of them didn't know what I was talking about. But it's that kind of feeling, or it's like a feeling as a parent when you see your child start to, attain their aspirations and things like that. That's what it's like when you, and it wasn't a mentoring thing. It wasn't like I had to do it, but it was just great to be able to see people grow and to do that, and then go on their own journey
not too dissimilar to
You're
mine.
invested in them and their growth.
Wow.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful to hear. Thank you for taking us through that and through your journey.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's lovely to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.